Hello? Hello? Welcome to FNAF'S Pizza, a magical place for kids and grown-ups alike, where fantasy and fun comes to life. So, just be aware, the characters do tend to wander a bit. They're left in some kind of free roaming mode at night. They used to be allowed to walk during the day too, but then there was the bite of 87. Yeah, it's amazing that a human body can live without a frontal lobe, you know? Sounds fun. Let's play. One of the first big mysteries of the very first game is about the bite of 87.
Was that the bite of 87?
It's also a mystery why you haven't subscribed yet. It's concluded that in 1987, security guard Jeremy Fitzgerald was on the job during a birthday party. Details are fuzzy, but somehow Jeremy managed to get bit by one of the animatronics. According to the phone guy, he survived the bite, but he lost his frontal lobe. So let's take a look at the psychology here. What effects does losing your frontal lobe have on your psychological well-being? And before that, what even is the frontal lobe? Let's start there. The frontal lobe is the lobe at the front of the brain. Your brain consists of 4 different parts. The occipital lobe, the parietal lobe, temporal lobe, and of course the frontal lobe. Each lobe has a different function and is responsible for different tasks. The occipital lobe is responsible for visual perception, including color, form, and motion. The parietal lobe is vital for sensory perception and integration. It basically manages all your senses. The temporal lobe is associated with processing auditory information and with encoding of memory. And last, the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is responsible for many things, including executive functions like planning, decision making, and problem solving, but also muscular movement, memory, personality, emotions, and more. So, if there would be an injury to the frontal lobe, or even if it would be removed entirely, there would be a tremendous change personality-wise. They would struggle much more with living their everyday life. They would make decisions they normally wouldn't. They would struggle performing tasks, but also they struggle with controlling impulsive behavior. A famous case is that of Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage was railroad construction foreman in the mid-1800s. One day, while he was working, something terrible happened. He was using a long metal rod that he used to pack explosive into a hole to clear the way for a new railroad track. The tamping iron accidentally slipped out of his hand and shot up through his cheek and went through the top of his head, passing through the frontal lobe. It was an awful injury and it should have killed him instantly. However, Phineas didn't die. He even remained conscious and was able to talk and walk around after the accident. Now, what's particularly fascinating about Phineas Gage's story is how he changed. Before the injury, he was described as responsible and respectful, but after the injury, he became impulsive, irascible, and exhibited poor judgment. He was no longer the same person he used to be. Phineas Gage was given medical attention soon after the accident. His wound was cleaned and he received some basic treatment. Surprisingly, Gage's physical health improved relatively quickly. He could walk and talk and his physical injuries healed to some extent. However, Gage's personality changes made it difficult for him to return to his previous job as a railroad man. He struggled to maintain steady employment and drifted from job to job. Gage lived for several years after the accident, but his life was marked by the challenges due to his personality changes. He eventually passed away in 1860, about 12 years after the accident. He was only 36. Even though his death wasn't directly related to the accident, it is believed that he probably died due to epilepsy-related seizures, which he began to experience after the accident. So it is possible to survive without a frontal lobe, but it heavily affects who you are and what you can do. And both in the game and in this example it's an extreme case, but less extreme cases of damaged frontal lobes happen every day. For example, with boxing matches, where the brain gets blows on the regular. There are many reports that retired fighters suffer from behavioral difficulties, such as irritable, aggression, lack of social judgment, impulsivity, and emotional lability, but also something called punch-drunk syndrome. They experience tremors, speech problems, and confusion. All of these symptoms could be caused by a damaged frontal lobe. If we look back at Five Nights at Freddy, there is also another incident, the bite of 83. The crying child is also bitten by an animatronic, however he didn't survive his injury. If the damage was less intense and he sustained the same damage as Jeremy did, he'd probably recover more than Jeremy would have. That is because the brain of a child is way more plastic than that of an adult. The brain possesses a degree of plasticity, which is the ability of the brain to reorganize and adapt in response to injury. In young children, the brain generally has a higher level of plasticity than adults. This means that the brain may be able to compensate for the loss of function by reorganizing and using other parts of the brain for tasks that were previously handled by the damaged frontal lobe. Also, the age at which the damage occurs can have a significant impact on recovery. In children, the brain is still developing. Neurological pathways are still being formed at an incredible rate. Because it's still forming, it is easier for the brain of a child to adapt and recover certain functions compared to adults. A famous case of this phenomenon is that of Jodie Miller. When she was 3 years old, she began experiencing seizures. They were happening at a very fast rate. At the highest point, the seizures were happening every 3 minutes. The doctors found out that it was all happening on one side of her brain, but what they did was incredible. They removed that whole side of her brain. What happened next is a show of how insane the brain can be. All the functions that were lost were taken over by the other side of the brain, and only 10 days after the surgery, she just walked out of the hospital as if nothing ever happened, and she never experienced a seizure anymore. The only problem she sustained from it was a slight paralysis in her arm, but still, she lives a normal life with only half a brain, and only because her brain was plastic enough to adapt. Even though we don't know what happened to Jeremy after the bite of 87, we can assume that he had a similar trajectory as Phineas Gage. He probably couldn't hold a job after his injury. Good thing he did make $120 working for 36 hours. To be honest, I wish I made it on this video. Thanks for watching.